fall into this crowd. I would hardly call it a life crisis, more of a gray area where naive meets wisdom. And I know this description is pretty right on because I found it in the Urban Dictionary, and you can Google the Urban Dictionary. And it describes a woman in her late 20s as no longer nice and open-minded and not yet kind and wise. Not nice and open-minded and not kind and wise yet? That's a pretty hard description to swallow for a 27-year-old. But it's true. I sort of fit that description. I don't know how many times I've told people I would have let you get away with that when I was 20. I would have probably just smiled and nodded at you, but I can't do that anymore. I also find myself being really, really impatient with the world and having to let everybody else know about it, as if I haven't learned to keep my mouth shut yet. So there's a little wisdom to still be learned on my part. So my friends and I also discussed this topic. You know, we feel so different when we're in our late 20s compared to our early 20s, and we don't know why. So I decided to do a little bit of research on it to figure it out. Well, apparently a lot of things happen, which may seem like a life crisis to some people. For one thing, you can rent a car finally at 25. Or you can go on a Carnival cruise without a chaperone. And I can see how this could cause a life crisis, whether you're going to decide to go on a boat full of food across the sea, or whether you're going to go across the country and hope you've got enough songs on your iPod to cover the trip. But in all seriousness, there are some physical changes. Scientists have found that the brain of an early 20-year-old is dramatically different than a late 20-year-old. There's a lot of wrinkles in the late 20-year-old brain. And you get those wrinkles from learning. So I don't think it'd be too far off to say that you've made so many mistakes in your early 20s that you've got all those wrinkles in your late 20s from learning. So there's a consolation for parents that your kids do learn in their early 20s from their mistakes. I don't know what they do with that learning lesson. That's beyond my scope of education. Another thing that changes is when you check your demographic box. You check male or female, and I check female. And then the next category is, are you 17 to 24? Well, a lot of people check that for a long time. You're still kind of a teenager, it's fun. And then the next category is 25 to 34. All of a sudden, you're in the 34-year-old category. I guess that could cause a complex for some people if you think that 30 is not fun. I have yet to find that out. I also found out that the average American gets married in their late 20s. Now that's a life crisis. I don't care what people say. You know, they say that you learn sharing when you're 3 and you learn compromise when you're a teenager with your parents. I believe that doesn't mean squat until you're married. I remember my first experience of learning how to share with my husband. We were at a Starbucks, and I bought 2 egg sandwiches and 2 coffees and 1 muffin because I'm frugal. I didn't want to spend another $1 or so on a muffin. So we're waiting for our coffee, and he gobbles down his breakfast sandwich, and the muffin's still there, and he starts to look at it, and I tell him you should wait to get your coffee because it tastes wonderful when you eat a muffin with coffee. Because I'm trying to be foreign, and so I have to teach him the etiquette of Starbucks. He totally ignores me and starts chowing down on the muffin. And I'm just looking at him, eyeballing him, seeing how far he's going to take this. So he finally leaves 1 crumb, and I'm not exaggerating, it's like this big, on the paper. So I take that crumb to salvage my dignity and that he didn't listen to me and put it on my side of the table on my napkin, and I continue to read the newspaper. He proceeds to reach all the way across the table and take that little crumb and stuff it in his mouth. And I just look at him so angrily and just unbelievable that my husband could possibly ignore my request to not eat that muffin. So after that, I bought 2 muffins. Everything's 2. Even 2 of the same kind of roll of sushi is required in our relationship. Another thing I discovered after the age of 25 is that people gain 1 to 1.5 pounds per year after 25. And, you know, I guess I could say I'm starting to gain it. It's harder to keep that off. But I also found that there's a consolation prize. Because in your early 30s, your peak cardiac endurance is great, which is why most runners in the Olympics are in their early 30s and do really well. So those who are worried about whether that 5 to 7.5 pounds are going to make a difference. You can lose it in your early 30s. There's no need to worry about it. But doing my research, I still found that there was things that weren't addressed. You know, I couldn't Google the answer to what exactly happens between early 20s and late 20s. So I started to think about my own life experiences, and one of the things I realized I have to do is stretch before I exercise. I remember being 20 and I could go play a sport and get up the next day and feel just great. Nothing's wrong with me. There was this time when I was 26 and I did this like really easy activity. I pulled a muscle and I was just like, what's going on? I ran to the doctor. I'm like, what's going on with me? I'm sure that there's some kind of weird disease going around. And he just looked at me and he smiled and he laughed. And he said, it's called getting older. Don't bother me with your visit about a strained neck muscle. I also realized that I like to rent movies rather than going to the movies. I find that I don't like crowds anymore. I'm not a person who likes to go to concerts anymore, where I used to love doing that because I wanted to be in the moment with everybody else. But I found that other 20-year-olds that are in their early 20s show up to those events. And I don't know, they're still, I guess, getting those wrinkles in their brains. So I think that's a little overrated to hang around them. But the main thing that they didn't put in that research is that people in their early 20s, I think, have a strong sense to be somebody important, somebody that changes the world, somebody who doesn't lead a stagnant life. I remember sitting in this English course at my community college, and every early 20-year-old said that their biggest fear was to have a stagnant life. They did not want that at all. They wanted to be important. But you know, when you're late 20s, you kind of realize that the world's going to work the way it's going to work, and you're just going to play a role in it, whatever it is. And so for me, I've got much smaller goals now, which is to be a good neighbor and to eliminate global warming. So as for this theory about a quarter-life crisis, I definitely wouldn't call it a quarter-life crisis. I would call it more of a coming of age.